Good morning, everybody. Welcome. This is the Society and Conservation Department Seminar Series. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome everybody who's joining on Zoom. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank our two co-sponsors, Montana Health Professionals for Retirement and Family Medicine Residency of Western Montana. We really appreciate their support for bringing us today. In the Metro New York area. She's a practicing psychotherapist and has worked extensively on parenting and attachment, on trauma, and on the intersection of climate and mental health. She is currently co-president of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. And in this capacity, she organizes and supports climate-aware mental health clinicians. She speaks frequently about the mental health aspects of, or the mental health impacts of the climate crisis, the varied ways in which mental health issues are interwoven with systems of inequity, Sorry, getting distracted by computer stuff. The psychological underpinnings of climate denial and the need to open compassionate space for people to engage their emotions and step forward into action. Rebecca has also worked as a public interest lawyer, supporting worker and immigrant rights. And she has extensive political organizing experience. She was one of the lead organizer for the Women's March here in Montana. She's also an accomplished photographer, and today she's going to be talking about climate psychology. And also just want to let you all know who are here live that we are recording on Zoom. And so when you ask questions, your questions will be in the Zoom recording. So with that, over to you, Rebecca.
Alrighty, thank you, Lori, and thank you guys for coming. And I'm just so glad to be back in Missoula, even though it's 30 degrees, which is a little offensive to me, because it's 70 degrees right now in New York. But I'm just super, super glad to be here. And I am, as Lori said, going to be talking about climate psychology, which is actually a pretty new field. And so it's growing and developing. And so I'll be really interested to hear what about this connects with people, what feels like it doesn't. Really super interested in hearing what people's reactions are to that. So feel free at the end of the conversation or the end of discussion. And so this presentation about climate change is likely somewhat different from other kinds of talks that you've attended or expect. It will not primarily be about the science, because we already know the story that the science tells. It will not primarily be about the technology, though the latest IPCC report reminds us that the technology is already here that could fix the problem. It will not even be about politics or strictly political activism, though anybody who knows me knows that I believe there is no more urgent task facing humanity than to build a planetary-wide social, cultural, political, economic, and spiritual movement for climate justice, reparations, and sustainability. Instead, it would be about something a bit more intimate, a bit more personal, and I would suggest a bit more foundational. It will be about emotions, about our lives, the things we fear, and the things we love. And so I'm going to ask, and Lori sort of passed out some paper and some pens to do just 2 writing exercises. And I know, as Lori also suggested, that could raise your anxiety level in the room. That's not the goal. I will not be asking you to share anything that you're writing, but I do actually want you to engage the questions, because they will help you drop in a little bit to the content of the talk and actually help explore what makes it hard to write, what makes it easier to write. Is it terrifying to engage the questions? Is it simple? Those are actually really, really important questions that we're all facing, both here and more generally. So I do invite people to take part in the writing exercises, and there'll be 2 of them. And in the first one, what do you love most about living on this planet? What do you care about most? And what do you uniquely offer by skill or by passion? So- Go on to the second one if people are feeling close to wrapping up. It's obviously only the beginning of that question. When you read about the risk of nuclear war or World War III, what do you find yourself feeling, doing? How do you cope? In the interest of time, I will go on. As we think about what we love about our life on this planet, what we want for our families and our relationships to this world, it can be very hard to take in our lived reality or our potential futures. It brings up all sorts of feelings in all of us. And I feel certain that when you contemplate World War III, nearly everyone in this room feels at least one of the following feelings: fear, overwhelm, helplessness, vulnerability, inadequacy, smallness, guilt, shame, anger, or exhaustion. And sustained over time, these exceedingly difficult feelings are very, very difficult to sustain. For many, they do not comfortably fall within what child psychiatrist Daniel Siegel calls our window of tolerance, a window of stimulation or arousal in which we're able to simultaneously feel what we're feeling, talk about them effectively, and interact and engage productively. Especially when we're asked to manage such difficult feelings without the support of others, many of us either blow out the top of the window by becoming hyper, impulsive, or chronically vigilant, or we bottom out and we become numb. We check out, we go offline. So whether it's contemplating the most recent IPCC report or processing headlines about the risk of nuclear war, it's quite possible that you respond the same way as the substantial majority of people in the United States. You ramp up or you start shutting down, or both. That is a form of anxiety, and you're not alone. It does not make you a bad person. It does not make you weak. It means you're human. And for many people in the United States, it's exactly how climate anxiety shows up. And that is where the field of climate psychology comes in. Climate psychology exists at many intersections, between the internal and external, between the individual and the systemic, between the human and the more than human, between an awareness of psychological defenses and the liberatory potential that can be found through new ways of relating to our social and environmental systems. To all of this, I'd add that we should also exist at the intersection of communication and policy, and between reflection and action. Within the mental health profession, come to think of it, within most professions, there are at least two lineages. There is one lineage that historically enabled or stood on the sidelines of bombs, destruction, norm enforcing, and racism, what the American psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton calls malignant normality. And here's what he had to say. Here we must look at the context of such witness and its connection with what I call malignant normality. All societies impose what can be called cultural and social norms, patterns of behavior that are expected of people in various situations, even if the behavior is harmful or dangerous. This can include behavior in basic areas of life, such as family or education, or political or social authority. It can also involve choices of energy sources for sustaining life in the 21st century. Professionals tend to adhere to these norms and even to legitimate and deepen them by means of their professional status. And then there's another lineage. And this lineage tells the story of human diversity, interconnection, care and suffering, the witnesses, as Lifton calls them. Witnesses hold stories and testify to break silence. They acknowledge and tell difficult truths. They find meaning and seek to ease and prevent the pain that this world sends up. And this is what he said about a witnessing professional. Hiroshima is the most extreme kind of destructive event, but we have learned that the effects of climate change can be no less extreme. Scientists have identified some of these effects as very much present in our immediate world and is posing a threat to human civilization over the course of the century. Surely the situation requires of us an ethic that enables us to confront truths having to do with catastrophic destruction of the human habitat and with ways of preventing or mitigating that looming catastrophe. In general, a witnessing professional both reveals profound dangers and seeks to combat them. And to my mind, the field of climate psychology is a field of witnessing professionals. And I mean this in both definitions of witnessing. We hold and see uncomfortable truths, and we encourage people to break silence, to testify, to speak. So how do we bear witness? First, we witness the very real mental health impacts arising from the concrete consequences of climate change, from drought, species loss, food scarcity, raging fires, chronic thirst, extreme heat, hurricanes, floods, homelessness, displacement. Climate psychologists document the trauma, the rage, the grief, the fear, the insecurity, the helplessness, the depression, the erosion of trust, belonging, a sense of home and community. We also call attention to the ways in which climate change amplifies systemic oppressions and existential threats, those oppressions and threats that already existed in ways that helped create the very crisis of which we now speak. Indeed, the American Psychological Association and EcoAmerica have recently documented such impacts in their 2021 report. Second, climate psychologists witness denial. And while I'll not spend too much time on this aspect of climate psychology, I here reference the cynical, organized, and orchestrated denialism of the fossil fuel industry, now grotesquely and catastrophically capitalizing on the devastating war in Ukraine. In this context, climate psychologists help make sense of distressing political questions playing out around us all the time. For example, if world leaders and corporate executives know that our species' survival is at stake, why are they not addressing it? Do they actually believe their own disinformation? Do they really believe it's not happening? Do they think it won't affect them? Don't they have kids? Third, climate psychologists witness and make sense of very common, ordinary, and yet deeply disturbing and disorienting psychological contradictions many of us face in the reality of our own daily lives. For example, we might ask, am I the only one who cares, or am I just crazy? Or if the April 4th, 2022 headline that says, the UN warns Earth is firmly on track toward an unlivable world, if that headline is really true, why does it all still feel like business as usual? How do I both hold the overwhelming reality of what is happening and still go on with the urgent demands and issues of my daily life? And with our climate communication colleagues, we try to answer an urgent question. How do we tap people's sense of care and agency to take action? Do we offer more facts? Do we raise alarms or offer hope? Do we point to progress and solutions? Or do we demonstrate how inadequate the political responses still are? Indeed, we help explain the deep undercurrents of emotion people are feeling in response to climate change, more generally, and how people find adaptive and maladaptive ways of responding to that emotion. And I mean that at the individual, community, and societal level. So before I go on, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here in this third witnessing role for climate psychologists. All around the world, including in the United States, climate-related distress is on the rise. While it may not always present as climate anxiety, climate scientists, climate teachers, climate activists, and frontline communities have been holding this distress for many years. But as the slow violence of grinding environmental injustice dovetails with the traumatic realities and news coverage of extreme weather events, more and more people are waking up to the enormity of the crisis. More and more articles are appearing around climate anxiety, and more people are recognizing a range of feelings that accurately or inaccurately come under that label. As researchers found from the field of climate communications last September, the number of Americans who are alarmed about climate change outnumbers for the first time the numbers who are dismissive. In fact, at least 70% of Americans are at least somewhat worried about global warming, and over 35% are very worried. In yet another study released at around the same time, a collection of international researchers found that globally, children and youth are particularly distressed. Large percentages of children and youth report that they feel the future is frightening, that they feel helpless, powerless, and angry. Around the world and in therapy offices, youth are reporting climate distress is impacting not only their daily life, but also their larger choices around major life events, whether to go to college, whether to have children. So on the one hand, we witness a growing swell of anxiety and worry, globally and including in the United States. A swell of anxiety and worry that is not remotely pathological, but in response to a moral injury based in reality, in people caring about their loved ones, their lives, and their futures. But on the other hand, both studies highlight additional key findings related to silence, dismissal, and inaction. Research indicates that even though a substantial majority of Americans are worried about climate change, 61% of all Americans rarely or never talk about it. Think about that. At Discovery, at Orange Street Food Farm, on Reserve Street, in our classrooms, or even in our therapy offices, the majority of people are silent about something that is causing them distress. And so it's tempting to make the error that climate psychologist Renee Lertzman warns us about. We mistake silence for apathy. And in response, many of us become shrill as we beat the drum of facts, fear, and science, as we shame through purist individualist consumption codes, and as we retreat into righteous despair after a day of hyper overextension or hypervigilant doom scrolling. People are such idiots. Humanity sucks, we think to ourselves. Burdened by this perspective, we make it harder to hear, harder to be heard, and harder for people to break their own silence. Expanding on their findings about youth anxiety, researchers made a related finding. More than half of all youth surveyed felt dismissed when they shared their fears. And their distress was directly linked to the fact that grown-ups are not doing enough about it. Not the political leaders, not school administrators, not those who control the economic and productive levers of society. Indeed, I work in the field of attachment and parenting, and I know that when adults are unable to tolerate their own feelings, individually or collectively, they will not be able to hold and tolerate the distress of their children, let alone address and provide solutions. So I will put it plainly. As much as it is not a reflection of apathy, it is nevertheless true that anxious and ineffectual silence only intensifies distress, immobilizes action, and escalates the climate crisis. So if it's not apathy, what is it? How do we understand what happens in this silence? Psychology, of course, is not a profession of silence. Indeed, it is a profession of conversation, of surfacing, sharing, and exploring feelings and emotion. And as climate psychologists, we know that in the context of climate change, silence means distress goes unsupported or unacknowledged. It gets sequestered from human connection. It is left dangling and isolated. In anxious and shamed silence, climate psychologists witness a range of defensive strategies and vulnerabilities. For example, we witness disavowal, an awareness that something is happening, but then a turning away. In a beautiful turn of phrase, one psychoanalyst called it the unthought known. We know, but we live as if we don't, or we live as if it won't affect us, as if it's far away, as if others will take care of it, as if others know more, as if we're exceptions. Overwhelmed or ashamed by the bigness of the problem and the vulnerable or perceived smallness of our own personhood, disavowal is a way of managing very, very uncomfortable feelings. When Hurricane Ida hit my region in New York, just outside of New York City, many roads and highways and school track fields were flooded and ruined. But in the city, immigrant families died from flooding in illegal basement apartments owned by predatory landlords. And while I tried hard to see and hold, I too psychologically turned away, relieved that just 15 miles north, the floods were not deadly. Even close by, it was far away. But not only is far away getting closer and closer, but in turning away from feelings, we also turn away from what we care most about, each other, our sense of connection, our authenticity. And in cutting off those parts of ourselves, we get further away from addressing the problem. We also witness getting busy, an effort to push away the feelings through action, action, action. And by action, I do not mean productive, collaborative, and intentional action towards a stated goal of culture and policy change, but instead something internally feverish, self-punishing, highly moralistic, highly dependent on individualism. Despite having extremely sophisticated systemic analyses, and despite knowing that the problem is far bigger than ourselves, many nevertheless manage very hard feelings from a place of guilt, perfectionism, purity, and vigilance. This defense looks like paralysis at the grocery store, late night cataloging of one's carbon sins, guilt that one can't single-handedly live outside the web of the fossil fuel economy. And finally, we know that silence can lead not only to disowning feelings, but to disowning people. Not only does silence make people more easily seduced by the organized denial and merchants of doubt of the fossil fuel industry, but they're more open to the false flag solutions of fascists, ready to scapegoat and sacrifice the frontline victims of climate change. And here, I do not want to mince words. As we have all learned from the pandemic, itself related to widening extractive industries, mass human insecurity and suffering does not necessarily generate collaboration, connection, or empathy. In an article that appeared in The Guardian about 6 months ago, just after COP26, Oliver Millman reported that the far right is beginning to lean into this crisis, tapping the insecurity and directing it towards the frontline victims of climate change through nationalism and harsh borders. The stakes are very, very high as we witness violent authoritarian trends around the globe, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Hungary, and of course, to wretchedly awful consequence in Russia, and ominously, perhaps, in France. Trump was not an exception. He was not an anomaly. And in Arizona, the state attorney general used climate change as a reason to exclude immigrants. So that brings me to the fourth and final witnessing role for climate psychologists. We witness by breaking silence. We help people face their fear and expand their own resilience. And here I agree with Katharine Hayhoe, an exemplary climate communicator and scientist, who continues to say that the single most effective climate action we can take is to talk about it. And we aim to do this at all levels, within the individual therapy room, within larger groups and organizations, and within society. First, at the individual level, we break silence through climate-aware therapy. In this kind of therapy, we break down the barrier between the office space and the external world. Mindful not to proselytize, we nevertheless assess for climate distress, we assess for avoidance, we acknowledge the scale of the problem, and we explore the ways in which we each show up to this crisis with our own histories, our own experiences, our own relationship to privilege and interpersonal dynamics. And here I'll use an example from my own practice. In individual counseling, I am seeing a woman I will call Sonia, who is in a heterosexual marriage. She sought out climate-aware therapy because she has a great deal of climate anxiety, and she and her husband were agonizing about whether to have a baby. She is white, middle class, socially and politically active, and she comes from a family that struggles with OCD and other forms of anxiety. In the same way that she feels guilty taking time off from activism, she feels guilty bringing a child into this world. Her husband is South Asian from Bangladesh. His family has been on the front line of climate change and climate-related devastation for decades. And to him, having a baby is about affirming life, a way to acknowledge that despite chaos, people always manage to find joy and reasons for living. Of course, there's no right answer. For both members of this couple, their way of managing, making choices, and finding meaning in this crisis are uniquely related to how they've experienced the world. As a climate-aware clinician working with Sonia, it is essential that I validate her experience of this crisis. It is real, and it is getting worse. If she chooses to have a child, she will not be able to fully protect that child from a world growing more unstable. Sonia's feelings of anxiety are not merely recapitulation of her old family dynamics, organized as they are around anxiety. They are additive. But two, Sonia's particular response to climate anxiety also came from a deeper place within herself, a place that did not feel entitled to joy, that resolved anxious socioeconomic contradictions through self-blame, moral ambiguity through rigid absolutes, and future uncertainty through reliable despair. She said to herself, I come from privilege. I need to sacrifice. To have a child is wrong, and I know the world is doomed. In our individual work, bearing witness for Sonia is to listen to her story and support the activist work she chooses to do to address it. But no matter what this couple decides about having a baby, it is also to support her right to happiness and her capacity to tolerate both uncertainty and less binary, more nuanced ways to imagine moral options in an increasingly chaotic world. Second, at a group or organizational level, we break silence through climate cafes. In facing a very uncertain and potentially chaotic future, we need, almost above all else, the capacity to work past our understandable defenses, be emotionally flexible and resilient. Indeed, with such resilience, we are far more capable of connecting with others, expressing our needs, multi-problem solving, and productively collaborating on socially just and adaptive solutions. In this context, we draw on insights from the world of social psychology. For example, in her book, Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life, Kari Norgaard explores the myriad ways in which culture, politics, national identity, economics, emotions, and social norms collude in staying quiet or skating at the surface of awareness about climate change, or, as we likely all feel, nuclear Armageddon. Even, or perhaps especially for those working in the field, many worry that in bringing up hard feelings and strong reactions around others, they will infect others, demoralize a space, appear indulgent when other people have it worse, or worst of all, that they will become paralyzed and unable to move forward. As one way to gently open space, we offer climate cafes. And in these, we bring up what is often not named. We give room to speak about existential fears and other hard feelings. And while this sounds terribly stressful, I have led several such cafes to various groups of people, and I can attest that in becoming witnesses for each other, we feel we're not alone. We're actually not crazy, that others do care, that others will share the load. Invariably, what emerges out of these cafes are feelings of connection, spaciousness, relief. Often people begin sharing ideas for further collaboration and action. And yes, sometimes we laugh. And after leading one such climate cafe with a group of local parents and teachers, several people approached me to let them know that after the cafe, they found the courage to raise the issue with their children in their classrooms, and discovered a depth of feeling and awareness that they had not previously known was there. Connecting with others, these parents and teachers experienced their own expanded tolerance for the scary and uncertain, and were then able to hold space for and tolerate the feelings for their children and students. often interpreted as some misty, abstract concept. This is precisely what we mean when we talk about fostering resilience, from parent to child, friend to friend, neighbor to neighbor, teacher to student. These conversations expand our capacity to stay present with hard realities and enable us to find more room to move and create as we make our way through this uncharted territory. And third, at a societal level, we break silence by speaking beyond the received boundaries of our profession. In this ominous period of war, climate collapse, anti-science hucksterism, and global fascist trends, I believe that we all need to question the ideological constraints of our professions, and for mine, the limitations contained within the therapeutic space. In my realm, what that means is trying to expand the reach and utility of our psychological insight by collaborating with those working in other spaces. Indeed, I believe that in popular Western cultural, political, and activist discourse about climate change, we are both sorely lacking and sorely needing psychological insight. Moreover, just as climate change itself will not be ameliorated simply through individual reductions in our carbon footprints, the scale of this crisis means that our alienated and anxious psyches will need far more than individual or small group reflection, no matter how essential I believe those are. Indeed, without the transformative, enlivening, and often validating process of creative and collective engagement, I do not believe we will adapt to what's coming in healthy or pro-social ways. It is therefore essential that clinicians contribute their psychological body of knowledge and weigh in on the climate crisis and help grow a healthy, sustainable movement for climate justice. As the poet Seamus Heaney wrote once, two sides of every question, yes, yes, yes. But every now and then, just weighing in is what it must come down to. And by itself, such weighing in goes against the norms of my profession, which too often hides behind a so-called neutral stance that regards overtly political involvement as inappropriate and activism as the impulsive, unruly, or restive child of the more mature, reflective adult. But not only does this stance collude with the disavowing fantasy that others will do the messy work of demanding change, but it misses the ways in which speaking and acting collectively can not only foster resilience, but transform our own sense of what's possible. Indeed, to be a climate-aware clinician is to remember that mindful reflection is not the opposite of action. To the contrary, it enables action to be intentional, relational, directed, sustained, and effective. So how do we weigh in? How do we draw on our psychological insight and expand beyond the privatized space of our four clinical walls? As I explore this, it must be acknowledged that in this emerging new field, we are building the airplane as we fly it. It is an exploring and questioning work in progress for me and for many others. But I will say that I think it is critical that our field participate and lend insight into the public sphere of climate communication, climate journalism, and climate action. As the volume of articles appearing around climate anxiety indicate, the bubble of psychic safety regarding climate change is bursting rapidly. This presents several extremely consequential challenges and hopeful opportunities. As we've seen, progressives do not own the issue of climate anxiety, and right-wing authoritarians are finding ways to mobilize around fear. Insofar as we seek a just and equitable response to issues of climate change, it is essential that climate psychologists help meet this growing and publicly acknowledged anxiety with exceptionally sophisticated, nuanced, and compassionate messages. Thus far, most wide-ranging and visible efforts to engage people around issues of climate have portrayed most people as apathetic, needing more terrifying information about facts, technology, and individual responsibility. But unfortunately, as we have seen, identity and emotions speak far, far louder than facts. In this cultural sphere, it is crucial that we listen to the anxiety, understand psychological defenses, and shape a message that uses more heart and less lecture, one that is more generative and less paralyzing, more collective and less isolating, more empathic and less shaming, more imaginative and less factual. For the silent but anxious majority, the majority that needs to speak and get engaged, I believe this approach would be more successful and transformative. And as the network of climate-aware clinicians grows across the country, our field will be in a better and better position to amplify mental health concerns in the media and shape the ways in which climate distress is understood and addressed. Indeed, insofar as we expand, our field will gain expertise in the various languages and experiences of climate distress. And from this body of lived knowledge, clinicians will be able to broaden and deepen media coverage related to climate mental health, and in that way, help build greater momentum for climate action. National leaders can bury the issue beneath the dry debates about hard infrastructure, gas prices, and inflation, which can feel distant, disconnected, or more urgently monetized. But whether we are talking about a Republican lobster fisherman in Maine who denies climate change but fears lost income and generational identity, or a left-wing climate activist fleeing fires in Northern California, or a Montana rancher terrified of drought, or a hipster Boulder College student traumatized from the Marshall fires, or an impoverished New Orleans family fleeing tornadoes while still repairing damage from their last hurricane. Experiences and stories of mental health, on the other hand, are harder to politicize and deflect, as they are more intimate, embodied, familiar, and mobilizing. Less immediately red or blue, stories of climate distress can be used at all levels and in many arenas to substantiate and mobilize support for climate adaptation strategies, climate lawsuits enjoining further extraction, or expanded and diversified mental health services. And examples are endless. And finally, we can draw on our psychological understandings of trauma, post-traumatic growth, and resilience to imagine and support creative, life-affirming, and sustainable climate action. And while the sky is the limit regarding climate action, I will offer some thoughts about the emotions in which we want to root our choices and reflections about what action should look like. To root our engagement, I agree strongly with writer and environmental educator Sarah Jaquette Ray, who recommends that we focus less on individual guilt and more on what we love, what we desire in our life. This is mine. As much as it is important to recognize and acknowledge one's relative degree of privilege and how that impacts our own choices and experiences of climate change, it is critically important that we embrace our sense of joy, our desires, our passions, our connections to each other, to our sense of place, to our lived environment. We need to always stay connected to what matters, to remember the future we are living for, not the one we're afraid of. We see in therapy offices and climate cafes that guilt can become paralyzing and preoccupied, whereas an embodied yearning for all that is in our life generates movement and capacity over the long haul. As one climate activist reminds us, in a world embedded in fossil fuels, we're all climate hypocrites, so let the guilt go. No matter what we do in response to the issue of climate change, let it come from a place of desire. Indeed, as we face our fears, let's be motivated by love. and frequently. This is where debates about activism get reduced to somewhat false binaries between individual and systemic change. And don't get me wrong, I obviously believe we need fundamental systemic change. But to recognize the need for systemic change does not in turn mean that individual actions are meaningless. To the contrary, they're essential. Many of us are separated from and may not know the long and extraordinary history of mass movements to end colonization, for human rights, for civil rights, for child labor laws or union rights. And in this not knowing, questions of individual action often get reduced to our role in the world as consumers of food, of objects, of resources. Yes, it does make sense to think about a relationship to consumption, and it's valuable to see how our consumption depends on global networks of often invisible, extractive, and inequitable capitalist relationships. But far beyond the human capacity to consume is our capacity to feel, to relate, to create, to share purpose and ideas. More than individual consumers who carefully curate our purchases, we are social beings who live in relationships with others who, as we have seen, have the same fears and the same loves. So in whatever actions you decide to take, whether it's forming mutual or collaborative programs that model new ways to meet human needs, advocating for climate change educational curriculums, pushing law firms to abandon fossil fuel corporations, urging colleges to divest, building multiracial labor unions that can challenge climate-crushing industries, demanding responsible climate journalism that pairs crisis with solutions, foreground speaking, foreground naming, foreground relationships, sharing experience, expanding connection, broadening collective knowledge. Not only will this have far greater impact than individual consumption and lifestyle choices, but it will expand our collective resilient capacity. And to wrap up, I will say a few final words about uncertainty. Above all else, humans find it incredibly hard to live within the unknown. We seek comfort in certainty, whether that means certain doom or techno-optimism. But as much as things do look bleak, as much as we know there will be suffering and major social upheavals, such binary certitude erases human emotions and human agency, historical contingencies, and always arising creative and revelatory contradictions. We simply do not and cannot know what lies ahead. And in that space lies what Sander Lebowski calls radical hope, a hope that depends not on disavowal, but on the metaphysics that affirms change and possibility, agency and power, novelty and creativity, and value and importance. Indeed, to paraphrase James Baldwin, wherever human beings are, wherever human beings are, we at least have a chance, because we're not only disasters, we're also miracles.
About 10 minutes for questions, so please feel free to raise your hand if any questions for Rebecca.
At the beginning of the presentation, you had a slide that kind of depicted common responses to stress, and at the bottom of that slide, you have the term hypoarousal. Hypoarousal. And in kind of the finer print there, it mentioned that mindfulness and breathwork and physical activity were responses that are associated with that. Why would those responses be considered, or in my head, those are healthy responses to distress. So why would those be considered?
I think that they're associated as a way of dealing with hypoarousal. That, in fact, mindfulness helps deal with hypervigilance, hyperarousal, as well as hypoarousal. So it's correlated as a way of addressing hypoarousal.
Oh, I see. Addressing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But yes, absolutely. Those are really, really important skills to develop: mindfulness and a capacity to hold and watch a feeling come and go. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess as a student here at the Department of Sustainable Conservation, I'd say in like many white spaces when we talk about climate change, is kind of one takeaway. And many BIPOC spaces where I talk about climate change is another takeaway, specifically tying it to colonialism. And so I guess I'm curious if you could speak towards the anecdote you shared about Sonia and her partner from Bangladesh, and less so on the baby making and more so on the like, if you were doing like couples therapy with them, how would you navigate those differences in experience with the like,
That's a great question.
this is one part of a broader whole of oppression versus this is like, sometimes it feels like the first form of oppression that people have got.
Yes, that's a really great question. I will not be able to do it justice in this space, but it's quite complicated because we obviously internalize cultural histories and stories and legacies that we did not personally experience. And so her husband, for example, has all of these stories in his family history, all of the generational trauma in his history, and then all of the racism that he experiences in the United States. And in response to all of these things, his feeling is he wants to have a baby. It is his way of claiming life. It's his way of resistance, really, in many respects. For her, the goal is that she needs to really understand that. And she needs to understand that her anxiety taps into something that's stopping him from realizing something he needs. But at the same time, it flips, right? It's because that for her to have a child in this situation, she feels profoundly compromised as a parental caregiver, completely distressed that she won't be able to provide safety. And so in that, what my goal would be is that they organize a way to understand each other's histories, understand where it comes from, and find a way to come to a solution and compromise, either through adoption, which is one thing that they're really actively thinking about. He's trying to figure out if that meets the needs he has. She's trying to feel like, well, I still won't be able to protect him, you know? So she's raising lots and lots of different questions, but the goal isn't to convince them one way or the other. The goal is for them to understand their own histories, understand where it comes from, and then understand that they are a relationship that needs to meet each other's needs. They are much more than just a representation of the larger political forces. So it would be hard, and they're struggling.
I've heard so many times that, and you mentioned too, that the way to reduce or work through anxiety is to call to action. What kind of action do you see, and how big and how small can it be? Your thoughts on a variety of actions that can be taken that will be effective.
I mean, there's a lot to say about the relationship between anxiety and action, and I absolutely think that for people who are feeling anxious, if they have some sense that they are, well, let's think about the fight, flight, freeze response of trauma. Traumatic reactions usually happen most when you don't have the capacity to respond effectively. You can't run away, you can't push it back, you can't fight it off. You're stuck dealing with the inner turmoil as the trauma happens. When people have the capacity to act in some way upon those feelings and have the sense of conviction that it's addressing what hurts them or what would be frightening, that will absolutely give them a sense of agency and reduce their level of anxiety. But it does depend on the kind of action we're talking about. So I work with high school kids sometimes, and these are kids who they're in the middle of identity formation. They're doing all sorts of other things they're struggling with. So for them, when they think about action, they become exceedingly compulsive about what to buy, how to buy, arguments in their family, and then they end up creating hugely alienated relationships around them because their only sense of action is what they can do with their own bodies and their consumption. And so In fact, it looks an awful lot like an eating disorder in some respects, but they will control this massive, massive crisis by regulating their body. And so often what I'm trying to suggest and what I say in here is that the kind of action needs to emphasize both joy and relationships, because that kind of action cuts against the kind of internalizing self-blame that individualist action breeds. So yes, I absolutely believe that action is necessary, both to relieve anxiety, but to address this crisis. But I'm not agnostic about the kind of action. I think some actions can drive it worse and make it harder, and make people feel even more hopeless and helpless and diminished as a result. And so the goal that I'm talking about is action that does the opposite, that reaches in towards people they love, creates conversation, creates collaboration, gets larger than themselves.
I have a question from the Zoom group. This is about your response to the positive psychology movement manifested at by the Happiness Project within Counselor Ed. How do we both acknowledge fears, anxieties, etc., and help kids and ourselves not spiral down into despair?
I think that's very similar to what we're talking about here. And I also don't think that we can stop kids from spiraling into despair at different times. I think that the exposure of social media, the way in which journalism, we often get plastered. I did a talk in a school where I showed all the horrifying images that can come up of fires and hurricanes and various other things, and how kids, their entire sort of hypoarousal system just rose. And they were already somewhat dysregulated in the class because the media is showing very specific images over and over and over, but not coupling those images with solutions, not coupling those images with a sense of relationship and connection. So if we live in a media saturated universe, I don't think we're going to be able to prevent that, which is why we need to have parents capable of holding their own fears, capable of acknowledging it, so they can check in with their children. They can provide that space of care. They can provide the container that says, it's okay, we understand what you're scared of. Acknowledge the fear. I will be here, and then look to the helpers, get involved, do all of that kind of work. Does that make sense?
Jen?
So I just, it seems like with climate change and a lot of issues, right, there's these acute events like a hurricane or a big disaster, right, that people kind of, there's a lot of energy, people react, and then it's almost like something else in the news comes up. And then you also have these systemic traumas, kind of like Jake was referring to, that happened with cultures going back in time, and then continuing on just like chronic, events that come from climate change as well. And so can you speak a little bit about how do you, I guess, deal with trauma when it's more of a chronic state across decades, centuries, cultures, versus acute events that are associated with climate change, where people respond. There's a lot of action that happens, and then people move on to the next, even though people are still very much affected beyond that event. So I don't know. Can you just speak to that? 'Cause it just seems like climate change touches things in very different ways, and people may be expected for people to cope faster or whatever, depending on how systematic or chronic this trauma is versus acute or one time or
But I was talking to a colleague who's been doing a lot of work in Puerto Rico, and the constancy of collective trauma over and over and over. And then in addition to that, very specific trauma of people dying, whether it's from COVID or from hurricanes, is just endless. And again, what's interesting, there's a lot of different models. I am very much learning in this sphere of different kinds of models, but there are a lot of people working in the world of public mental health, in community mental health, trying to develop community resiliency strategies. And what they have found is that they need certain basic ingredients as a community, is that that people need to feel as if they have decision-making capacity in the world around them, whether it's in their school, their neighborhood, wherever it is, that they have decision-making capacity, that they have expressive capacity, that they have an artistic or creative place to to address the feelings, but it's not all hyperverbal. But they also have I can't remember all of the different details, but the range of community resources that need to be expanded in order to develop the resiliency of the community, or what they often call it as post-traumatic growth. Because often we end up hearing about the language of trauma, we hear less about when work is done within the community afterwards, what kinds of growth can emerge, what kinds of feelings of solidarity, what kinds of feelings of connection and capacity building can grow. But that's also very labor intensive, and it can get swept away again at the next crisis. And so when we think about developing kind of public health and mental health response to climate, what many of us are thinking about now, we're trying to figure out in a kind of coalition kind of way, what is the relationship between individual trauma therapy and larger collective therapy? And I mean, how do we coordinate these things? And then disaster relief, you know, and after Hurricane Katrina, it was horribly inequitably distributed in terms of the care services. And so that then becomes another one of the issues, like how do you deal with the inequity? How do you deal with the systemic racism of that? That's part of the mental health system. So I don't have an answer to that. I only know it's a huge, huge, huge question that hopefully more and more of us are trying to figure out.
We are out of time for questions, unfortunately, but I'm sure Rebecca would be happy to stay for a few minutes, so you're welcome to come up and ask your questions. And thank you very much.
We'll take some more questions if people want to stick around. It's fine with me.